You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Autumn is the season of death. As we watch the foliage around us wither, brown, and fall at our feet, we are drawn to contemplate the end of things and what comes after. And as the harvester's scythe reaps the crops, we are encouraged to consider the specter of the grim reaper, and when even we may ourselves be collected. So it has always been, and so our fall holidays reflect this. Samhain, or Halloween, Dia de los Muertos, all reflect our fascination with death and survival beyond death in another world, from which those who have passed may revisit us. The ghost story is nothing new. It can be traced back ages, back even to the 3rd millennium BCE, and the earliest surviving work of great literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian poem about the storied life of an ancient king who at one point encounters the spirit of his dead friend, the wild man Enkidu. This ghost is said to have risen, quote-unquote, like a wind, and Gilgamesh questions him about the afterlife. Even the concept of a haunted place, specifically a haunted house, can be traced back to the ancient past. In the 3rd century CE, a certain play premiered in Rome, written by Plautus. It was called Mostellaria, which translated to the ghost play. It was a comedy in which a character attempts to block his father from entering a house where he is hosting a party, claiming the house is haunted by the ghost of a man who was once killed there. The play is thought to be an adaptation of an even older Athenian play by Philemon, titled simply Phasma, or The Ghost. Later, in the 2nd century CE, Pliny the Younger, another Roman author, told a story in a letter describing a creepy house in Athens from which issued disturbing sounds like the rattling of chains. In this dwelling place was seen the specter of an emaciated old man, and this spirit even led a certain Stoic philosopher to the place of his burial, where his bones were later disinterred and given a proper burial so as to lay his spirit to rest. So the notion of not only ghosts but of hauntings stretches back to the beginnings of human history. Yet how strange it is then that no evidence of the existence of spirits has ever been produced. Since the invention of science, no one has ever been able to come up with irrefutable evidence that a soul is real, that it may persist beyond death, or that such specters, whatever they may be, whether a surviving soul or a mere echo, have ever even really been perceived. We have only anecdotal evidence, but so much anecdotal evidence as to seem overwhelming. Of course, this lack of scientific proof of spirits or hauntings is not for lack of trying to collect it. Since the 19th century, there has arisen a specialty field comprised of experts who specifically seek to prove the existence of not only spirits, but other phenomena not acknowledged by orthodox science as well, such as mental phenomena like telepathy and telekinesis. They are parapsychologists, and they have expended great effort in studying and documenting ghost sightings, hauntings, and poltergeists, a specific kind of haunting in which a spirit is thought to move objects, make noises, and generally create physical disturbances. The fact that the field of parapsychology arose out of the movement of spiritualism in the 19th century, the belief in communication with the dead through mediums that conduct seance ceremonies, and the further fact that spiritualism started with a hoax and its practitioners were largely swindlers makes it very difficult to take the field of parapsychology seriously. Yet certainly there have been some among the ranks of parapsychologists who studied these phenomena in earnest, and it is an interesting subject to consider, since such claims remain more difficult to debunk and dismiss than many other such supernatural claims. One story in particular, I think, may serve as a microcosm of all haunting claims, as well as claims of parapsychological proof of the supernatural, and skeptical claims that such phenomena are largely hoaxes. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I just want to take a little break from the stuff I find really scary these days to talk about the stuff more traditionally viewed as frightening. So I'm getting into the spirit of things for October. Thank you for joining me for Poltergeist in Rosenheim. Before we start the episode, I want to thank my newest patron, Small Racer. Thanks to all my patrons. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on gerrymandering, I released an exclusive talking more about which party is more guilty of partisan redistricting, Republicans. And after my episode on the use of the military as a domestic police force, I released another about times when that was done in the 20th century, from the Bonus Army to LBJ's deployment of troops in Selma, Alabama during civil rights marches. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. As any longtime listeners know, I tend to practice rational skepticism when I'm considering most claims on this podcast. It's one of the reasons I tend to fare on the side of consensus history and science and debunk most fringe claims, whether they be conspiracist or supernatural. Rational skepticism does not, however, preclude the questioning of norms and of authority. It is not a worldview of conformity and blind acceptance. Quite the opposite. It values the challenging of consensus beliefs and popular claims, as long as that challenge is led by critical reasoning, logic, and empirical evidence, not by the kind of paranoid distrust of authority and fallacious logic that often characterizes conspiracist thought and claims of the supernatural. So in my view, when it comes to claims of ghosts and hauntings, there is no reason to dismiss such claims at the outset without considering them, although some healthy skepticism is warranted considering no evidence in support of the reality of the phenomena has ever been collected, while plenty of evidence of fraud has. The fact is, I've met ample people in my life, genuinely honest people, who have sincerely shared their personal experiences with me of having encountered or witnessed what they thought was some such spiritual phenomenon. Can I offer some potential rational explanation for their experience? Usually I can, but I don't. I view people's personal encounters with what they believe were ghosts much the same as I viewed their religious beliefs and experiences. It's not my place to refute that which may be a genuine visionary experience. Often they harbor their own doubts about their experiences, but even if they didn't, even if they were certain of them, it wouldn't be incumbent on a skeptic to disprove them, but rather on the person attempting to convince others of the reality of their experiences to prove they are real. Specific hoaxes, like the basis of Mormonism, may be appropriately debunked, and those who claim to have genuine evidence of the veracity or literal truth of the Bible may be refuted since there is evidence involved. But otherwise, belief in the supernatural, whether occult or religious, is by its very nature outside the purview of science and rational consideration in most regards. Take, for example, the parapsychologists' quote-unquote evidence of the supernatural, the idea of the, quote, uniformity of the occult, end quote. An argument whose sole evidence is that reports of phenomena like hauntings, precognition, telepathy, and psychokinesis have occurred throughout history and across a wide range of cultures and geographic regions, and that the reports are relatively uniform regardless of the reporter's age, education, or social standing. One could say the same thing about religion, as religious experiences and belief is largely similar throughout history, with beliefs in a higher power or transcendent reality, transformational visionary experiences, comparable practices and rituals, the commonality that believers typically derive some moral or ethical framework from their belief systems. But these religious beliefs are also entirely contradictory, such that this cannot stand as proof that they are all genuine or represent some truth. For that matter, mental illness has also been pretty uniform throughout the ages, but we would not claim this proves hallucinations are real. But while the burden of proof in all such claims lies with the claimant, and no convincing evidence of the existence of ghosts or hauntings has ever been put forward, their existence hasn't been proven impossible. Therefore, rational skepticism demands that I remain open to such claims. Though we must remain critical and wary, we should not enter into an examination of a ghost story already convinced that it cannot be real. The ghost story we examine now occurred in Rosenheim, a small Bavarian town whose residents during the Nazi era of the 1930s had both engaged in and resisted terrible anti-Semitic hate campaigns, a town which later endured terribly destructive bombings during the war. Having rebuilt itself and its community in the intervening years, in 1967, the town drew focus in the German press. In November that year, strange events in the law firm of one Sigmund Adam were reported. They had begun rather inconspicuously. The office started receiving phantom phone calls. Calls would ring through to one of their 4 phone lines, but when answered, no one seemed to be on the other end. Perhaps a wrong number or a prank call. Easy to explain away. But then they began to receive complaints that it was hard to get through to their office. The lines were always busy, they were told, but that didn't seem right. Then came the phone bills, exorbitantly high. There must have been some mistake, Adam was sure, so he examined the call records, and it seemed they were being charged for huge numbers of calls that he would later claim they did not make, many of them to the talking clock service, an automated time-telling service. According to Adam, these bills showed that their 4 old-fashioned rotary phones were sometimes all dialing simultaneously and at seemingly impossible speeds, calling 9 numbers in 2 minutes or making 46 calls in 15 minutes. He apparently disputed the charges, claiming that none of his employees were actually picking the receivers up and dialing those numbers. But of course, such a malfunction would have been impossible. The Deutsche Post dispatched technicians to see what the problem was, and Adam would later claim they had no explanation for how the phones could have been making those phantom calls. However, at the same time, it seemed that their offices were suffering some kind of power surges. Perhaps this offered some explanation. Workers in the firm thought little of these electrical outages at first. Perhaps faulty wiring was to blame. Or maybe the town's electrical grid was struggling to meet power demands. But then their lights started burning out. Light bulbs popped and shattered and had to be regularly replaced. Even the neon bulbs on the ceiling more than 8 feet overhead, bulbs designed to be less likely to burn out, started to go dark. When they pulled up ladders to replace them, though, they found that the bulbs were not burned out. Rather, they had been rotated out of their sockets. Finally, light fixtures began swinging, pictures on the wall began shifting, and a strange knocking was heard. It was apparent to Adam that they had what might be called a poltergeist, and that they could not go on working in the office until something was done about it. While ghosts are an ancient concept, the idea of a poltergeist, or at least the terminology, is of more recent origin. As far as anyone has been able to determine, its first use was in 1848 in a compendium of supernatural experiences called The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers, by author Catherine Crowe, the same book that first introduced the term and concept of a doppelganger. Though since both of these are German terms, and Crowe discusses them as German folklore traditions, there is every reason to believe the English writer did not coin them. Poltergeist is a combination of poltern, to make a sound, and geist, meaning ghost, and therefore essentially means noisy ghost, or as Crowe herself translated it, racketing specter, a term used to designate a specter that is not just seen, but heard, and perhaps felt, since its disturbances include moving and destroying objects. Crowe was writing at the dawn of the age of spiritualism, publishing The Night Side of Nature the very same year that the Fox Sisters of Western New York first reported their quote-unquote spirit rappings, perhaps the most famous poltergeist incident in history, and a ghost story that would really launch the entire spiritualist movement. They claimed their home was haunted by a man who had been killed there, who communicated with them by knocking. The following year, they were giving public demonstrations of how they communicated with ghosts through this rapping, the first public display of spiritualist seance. And eventually they became famous mediums. Not until decades later did they admit that they had faked the whole thing. But according to Crowe, quote, the phenomenon of poltergeists has been known in all countries and has been known in all ages, end quote. And this is a supportable claim. Even Pliny the Younger's story of the haunted house had the rattling of spectral chains, which would check the boxes of a poltergeist. The Glenluce Devil was a 17th century Scottish legend of a haunting involving thrown stones, as well as strange whistling and demonic voices being heard. The drummer of Tedworth was the report of a house beset with strange phantom drumming sounds, and even the far creepier scratching sound emanating from beneath beds. The Rosenheim Poltergeist refers to a late 17th century pamphlet reporting the, quote, expressions and actings, end quote, of a, quote, violent, noisy spirit, end quote. Moving into the early 18th century, reports of a knocking spirit in Epworth Rectory had a ghost nicknamed Old Jeffrey, causing thunderous running sounds and even blowing horns. In the second half of the 18th century, the country house Hinton Ampner near Winchester was deemed uninhabitable and torn down due to both apparition sightings and terrible loud noises. So there did exist a long history of such claims in Catherine Crowe's very own England to support her claim of its prevalence. Though as to the credibility of such claims, I'll have more to say later. Now for a brief intermission. If you're a people pleaser, it can be hard to say no. But if you want to say no, and you're being asked to say no, then it pleases everyone to say no. If you're still overpaying for wireless, then it's time to say yes to saying no. At Mint Mobile, their favorite word is no. No contracts, no monthly bills, no overages, no hidden fees, no BS. That's why I said yes to telling my overpriced wireless carrier, no thanks. Ditching my big wireless carrier meant ditching their jaw-dropping monthly bills, refusing their unexpected overages, and saying no thanks to their hidden fees. Mint Mobile gives you high-speed data and unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network. I couldn't believe the quality of Mint Mobile's wireless service in comparison to my old provider. And I got it all for just $15 a month. You can keep your phone, you can keep your phone number. You just don't have to keep paying those huge bills. Ready to say yes to saying no? Make the switch at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
At Blinds.com, it's not just about window treatments. It's about you, your style, your space, your way. Whether you DIY or want the pros to handle it all, you'll have the confidence of knowing it's done right. From free expert design help to our 100% satisfaction guarantee, everything we do is made to fit your life and your windows. Because at Blinds.com, the only thing we treat better than windows is you. Visit Blinds.com now for up to 50% off primetime deals and free professional installation. Rules and restrictions apply.
Hey listeners, quick question. Do you know what extraterrestrial radio signals and a mushroom from Texas have in common? Or what a number station is and why it's so haunting and creepy? If you're intrigued by those questions, Midnight Facts for Insomniacs has the answers.
Join us, Duncan and Shane, hosts, comedians, and best friends, on hilarious deep dives into obscure facts from science, history, and pop culture.
So whether you're nocturnal or just a fan of laughing and learning, we'll keep you entertained. Find Midnight Facts for Insomniacs wherever you're listening to this show.
Now, back to the show. To return to Rosenheim, Bavaria, more than a century after Crowe popularized the word poltergeist, the lawyer Sigmund Adam, apparently at his wit's end, reached out to Siemens, that massive energy company whose headquarters had been relocated to Bavaria after the war and who served as the local utilities provider. The thinking was that if there was some kind of power surge happening, perhaps this could explain everything. The strange telephone activity, the power fluctuations, and exploding light bulbs, if not the self-unscrewing neon lights, the swinging fixtures, and the knocking. But even as far as those strange things were concerned, perhaps the Siemens technicians might find that there was some strange electrical field or magnetic disturbance that could explain everything. The municipal power workers arrived, setting up monitoring equipment, such as voltmeters, to measure the power output throughout the building. By this time, the press attention had drawn television crews to the office, which recorded the efforts of the maintenance workers, who said they several times detected fluctuations or surges
Bis zu 60 Anrufe, beispielsweise bei der Zeitansage, innerhalb ganz kurzer Zeit.
that caused the needles of their gauges to jump to their highest points. Surges that should have blown fuses but did not, nor were circuits and wiring damaged. And when they set up an alternative power supply, inexplicably, they claimed to find the same thing. Physicists from the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics in Munich arrived to test for some physical explanation of these anomalous readings, such as some disturbance in the electromagnetic field, but found nothing abnormal. No one could offer any explanation, in fact, until the parapsychologist Hans Bender from the Freiburg Institute came to investigate. Bender was the parapsychologist who had come up with the dubious evidence of the supernatural I previously discussed, based on the uniformity of reports. During his time, Bender was a controversial figure. His full-throated defense of a field considered pseudoscience and his stubborn belief in supernatural or unexplained phenomena, even in the face of evidence debunking it, earned him the nickname Spook Professor, a German word whose meaning in English is quite apparent. Bender would remain controversial even after his death in 1991, when noted skeptics Joe Nickell and James Randi thoroughly discredited him, demonstrating how he would often continue to insist on the veracity of a poltergeist claim even when evidence of a hoax was uncovered, how he frequently exaggerated his observations, and how he even lied about his educational background. But back when Bender visited Rosenheim in the 60s, he still had some air of expertise about him, lending some weight to his assertion that Adam's office was not haunted by a spirit, but rather troubled by an employee with psychokinetic powers. Staying after hours to further observe the office, Bender's investigation recorded no such disturbances after the employees went home for the evening. Rather logically, I must say, he then hypothesized that this might mean one or more of the employees themselves was actually responsible for the phenomena, but not in the sense that there was some hoaxer among them. Instead, he came to the conclusion that some psychic phenomena was transpiring. Bender was not an innovator of this theory. There had long been observations that poltergeists tended to follow or center around individuals, often girls and young women, who came to be called quote-unquote focus persons. Some parapsychologists, notably Frank Podmore, who believed in ghosts but grew skeptical of mediumship, accepted the, in hindsight, I think, rather obvious conclusion that these focus persons were actually hoaxers, mischievously creating the phenomena themselves by furtively making noises and throwing objects when no one was looking. This was Podmore's naughty little girl theory of poltergeists, which certainly is convincing, especially since we know with certainty that the most famous poltergeist case, that of the spirit rapping of the Fox sisters, was faked by the popping of their knuckles. However, as parapsychologists tend to be true believers, many rejected this skeptical take and adapted the focus person theory to instead suggest the, quote, living agent theory, end quote, pioneered by psychical researcher Nandor Fodor in the early 20th century. Fodor argued that these phenomena centered around young people experiencing emotional and psychological turmoil, and that the disturbances were outward manifestations of their internal state, a theory that presupposes the existence of psychokinesis, or PK, the ability to affect the material world through mental effort. This idea that a focus person was going around unknowingly causing these terrifying phenomena was termed recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, and it was made rather famous in author Shirley Jackson's horror masterwork, The Haunting of Hill House, published in 1959, 8 years before the events in Rosenheim. So Bender wasn't really thinking outside the box when he decided that Anne-Marie Schaberl, a 19-year-old employee of the law firm, was the cause of the disturbances there. He claimed that they started only when she crossed the threshold and ceased when she left, that lamps only swung after she passed them, and that when light bulbs shattered, their glass shards actually flew in her direction. He even claimed that when these phantom calls were made to the talking clock, it was always when she was waiting for her shift to end. Anne-Marie denied having anything to do with the phenomena, but of course, Bender was not claiming she was conscious of the effects her mind was causing. Finally, she left her position at the firm, and the phenomena stopped altogether. Bender exulted. He claimed that Rosenheim was the first time in history that supernatural phenomena had been scientifically observed and confirmed, and he predicted that these phenomena would likely follow Anne-Marie to her next place of employment. But there were others investigating the well-publicized phenomena, skeptics who were less convinced, often stage magicians who recognize the trickery used to fool observers make the best rational skeptics. Harry Houdini was a noted skeptic of all mystical claims, as was the aforementioned skeptic and magician James Randi, and this tradition continues today with skeptical duo Penn and Teller and others. In Germany, in the 60s, the Austrian magician Albin Neumann, who performed under the stage name Alan, was one such magician/skeptic. He was a recognized expert on trickery, regularly called on in court to testify in matters related to scams and rigged gambling. Neumann published his findings in a 1970 book titled False Spirits, Real Swindlers. He revealed that during his investigation of the office, he found fine nylon threads attached to the chains from which lamps were suspended, which could be pulled to make them swing. He further found wall plates that could be shifted to make paintings appear to move of their own accord. He even discovered a black rubber truncheon hidden behind a shelf, as well as apparent marks on the wall where the truncheon had been used to make the notorious knocking sounds. The lawyer Sigmund Adam took Neumann to court, seeking an injunction to block the publication of his book. While I've only been able to find news reports about the case being heard, and don't know exactly the arguments made or the judicial opinion or verdict delivered, I think it's safe to say that in the years since, Neumann has been vindicated, Bender discredited, and the Rosenheim Poltergeist claim effectively debunked. As has since been pointed out, when Bender published his findings on the case, he never mentioned Neumann's discoveries, nor did he disclose that Anne-Marie Schaberl had a criminal past involving fraud. Also, Bender just never published any detailed reports about his investigation, only general conclusions, stating he had, quote, eliminated or checked every conceivable physical cause, end quote, without demonstrating how. And what specific observations he did record were inconsistent, for example, claiming that a painting on the wall turned more than 300 degrees, but later saying it turned only 120 degrees. And though Bender later reported that these poltergeist phenomena did indeed follow Anne-Marie to her next place of employment, at least for a short time, other reports have it that no such incidents ever occurred within her vicinity again. These inconsistencies and weaknesses in his investigation, coupled with Neumann's findings and later revelations about Bender's misrepresentations, serve to entirely discredit him. But even if we took his reporting at face value, there are logical problems with the Rosenheim Poltergeist claim. believers cling to the phone calls and the electrical phenomena as proof that something must have been going on other than hoaxes. For example, Bender says, quote, "The phenomena seem to be the result of non-periodic, short-duration forces," end quote. What does that mean? There is no pattern. But there was. He himself stated they only happened during work hours, which is when the employees were there to fake them. He also said himself that the disturbances, quote, "seem to be performed by intelligently controlled forces that have a tendency to evade investigation," end quote. Yeah, that sounds like a hoax, doesn't it? As for the phone calls, the Postal Service determined that the phones could not possibly have made connections and calls by themselves without the receiver being lifted and the rotary dials being operated. This does not prove something supernatural occurred. Quite the opposite, in fact. It seems to prove the calls must have been dialed by people in the office. 9 calls in 2 minutes was not so impossible, since they were operating 4 phones. It gives around a minute for each call. And even the seemingly astonishing 46 calls in 15 minutes could have been accomplished by that same timeline, using only 3 of their phone lines. A few people determined to play a prank, perhaps on their boss, who would have to pay that phone bill, could easily accomplish it, it seems to me. As for the electrical phenomena, even that is not unexplainable. Fooling with switches and fuses could create the outage effects. Throwing things at bulbs can cause them to break. And at 8 feet overhead, it would not be difficult to pull up a step or stool and surreptitiously unscrew the neon bulbs to complete the effect. As for the anomalous readings of the Siemens maintenance workers, which the television broadcast appeared to capture, really, if you watch it, which I did, it only shows the technicians stringing wires and looking at instruments. One statement is given by a technician.
Darüber hinaus haben wir dann einen Stromschreiber aufgebaut mit Stromwandler 50-5 Ampere, wobei wir dann die ersten Ausschläge bekommen haben. Wir waren überrascht, dass das gleich Vollausschlag war, sodass wir die korrekte Messgröße gar nicht erfassen konnten.
Quote, "We were surprised to immediately get full-scale deflections such that we couldn't even record the correct measured variables," end quote. This statement is not one of incredulity at an unexplainable phenomenon, but one of frustration with a failure of their equipment. The fact that such deflections in the gauges would seem to indicate such massive power surges that fuses would blow and wires burn out, but that did not occur, is reported by Bender and other believers as if it proved some paranormal occurrence, when in fact it just proved the gauges were misreading or had been tampered with. And indeed, this was the conclusion of physicist and skeptic John Taylor, who concluded in 1980 that these deflections were observed only on the chart recorder paper produced by the electric current meter, and not observed as they were being recorded. This expert, who examined the results himself, said it most likely had been caused by someone firmly pushing the needle of the gauge with their finger to the maximum and then letting go. Incidents such as these and others of even more verifiable fraud are a large part of the reason that parapsychology is considered a pseudoscience and why the credibility of parapsychologists is called into question. And even when there is not purposeful fraud on the part of the parapsychologist, the way they play fast and loose with the scientific method, cherry picking, failing to take precautions against cheating, conducting experiments without proper randomization, inventing new psi effects to explain results, and just the general unfalsifiability of their claims makes them pretenders at hard science. And perhaps the biggest problem is the fact that most parapsychologists firmly believe in the phenomena they study, seeking to prove its existence rather than remaining neutral and following the evidence. Confirmation bias taints their work thoroughly. Certainly among their ranks have been those who, like Frank Podmore, practice genuine rational skepticism, at least in some of their investigations, but most are drawn to paranormal explanations, even when there exist mundane explanations. Their Occam's razor is dull and rusted from disuse. Most ghost encounters can be handily explained, if not by fraud, then by hallucination, sleep paralysis, pareidolia, the power of suggestion, or simple low-light effects, as happens by the flickering of candlelight. Even the more concrete sounds and sensory effects of a poltergeist have been explained well enough by electromagnetic fields, infrasound, carbon monoxide poisoning, and toxic mold. As for the Rosenheim Poltergeist, perhaps Anne-Marie, with her history of fraud, was responsible for the hoax. Perhaps she recruited others for the telephoning prank, specifically aimed at their employer, Sigmund Adam. Maybe she and others only escalated the hoax when Adam claimed the phone calls were impossible and called the Postal Service to investigate, faking electrical surges to further cover up their shenanigans. Then, when the news became involved and paranormal investigators, their joke took on a life of its own. It's a working theory, but it technically is, unfortunately, a conspiracy theory. Some 40 witnesses were interrogated in these investigations, and none confessed. But of course, not all 40 would have to be involved in the conspiracy to fake these disturbances. I imagine at least 4 people would have to be in on the plot in order to operate all the phones. And that means 4 people who never revealed to the public what really happened, even years later. It's not that outrageous of a claim that 4 people perpetrated a hoax and never spoke of it again. And it's certainly a simpler explanation than that psychic powers or ghosts exist, despite clear evidence of them never having been recorded in all of human history. But still, the evidence is meager. Simply the skeptical magician Albin Neumann's claims of the nylon strings and truncheon against the lawyer Sigmund Adams' protests. I think in the end, as is the case in many a ghost story, we just have to chalk it up to an interesting story that we have good reason to doubt, but no proof about either way. Thank you for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Maddie Kinney, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Chris, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, an anonymous patron, Brian, CPJ MLT LTD, Jamie Nielsen, Wizard in a Tower, Martin Robistow, and Josh Haberman. I hope you patrons can appreciate a small break from my relentless dystopian political commentary and can get into the spirit of the season with me. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, self-described skeptics are often totally wrong. Science denial and fringe beliefs are often mischaracterized as skepticism. See RFK Jr.'s preferred terminology of vaccine skeptic instead of vaccine denialist. Pseudo-historians will present themselves as skeptical of consensus historical narratives, and pseudo-scientists, like parapsychologists, think of themselves as skeptical of mundane explanations. What I subscribe to is rational skepticism, though I'm sure everyone likes to think of themselves as rational. But it's the best way I know to differentiate denialism and conspiracism from skepticism based on critical thought and reasoning.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
I'm Matt Kaplan, the host of Safeguarding Sound Science, Evolution Edition. Evolution is the unifying principle of biology, yet it still breeds controversy a century and a half after Charles Darwin. Join us as we meet the passionate researchers and communicators who are expanding our knowledge and fighting to keep good science in our schools and politics. Subscribe to Safeguarding Sound Science on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you like to listen.